Well, thank you, and hello, everyone, and happy Thursday. I hope everyone is well and safe and healthy and happy and continuing taking good care of themselves in these challenging times. Um, Welcome to our Data Ethics Meets Identity panel. For what I hope is a provocative and helpful discussion today on data ethics and the intersection of identity in the connected marketing and advertising space, the smart data-driven field. Please meet Tom Corey, Vice President, Consulting Services at Acceleration USA.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, everyone. Well, in our modern society, first I'm going to frame it up, and then we're going to talk through some pre-prepared questions, and then I invite the audience to ask us questions, and then we have a little wrap up of key takeaways. But this is the framework. In the modern society, we are becoming increasingly connected. Our personal lives, our work lives, our social lives, school lives, and even our church lives. We connect with the marketplace digitally. Brands connect with us digitally. And the underpinning, or rather the dependency, is data. We live in a data-rich world. And broadly, there are two categories of data. Data that describes and data that connects. That describing data function is the attribute data, the things that tell what the what our interests are. The data that connects is commonly called identity. And this is a utility. For any of this connection to happen, for us to analyze data, bring data sets together, create cohorts, create audiences, reach and connect, you have to have a utility function that in our marketplace is referred to as identity. I think of it as the electrical grid. We depend on connecting data to reach for and connect with our audience, and then to recognize and serve the audience when they reach for and connect to us. Identity enables us to measure our marketing and advertising, and then optimize our audience experiences with our brand. Yet, this critical function and correspondingly the critical pieces of data that we need to enable the utility of connecting have also come into the spotlight along with the notion of data ethics. Some large players have disintermediated parts of the market from this utility. The ability to connect and the data that enables connecting is our topic today. Data ethics meets identity. Does ethics matter? It relates to human values. It relates to fairness and outcomes. If we bring that back into the world where we're living today and where we're trying to focus in on this panel, smart data marketing and the utility of identity resolution or identity and connecting either data sets or connecting a series of actions, it's the connecting function. So data ethics has a part to play because what you connect, you can take action on. So if I could, I'd like to turn to Tom. The background of pharma and patient outcomes is a really important foundation of ethics. Tom, could you talk a little bit on your perspective of data ethics framing in the marketing and advertising space, and then on how it relates to identity?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we think about data ethics, you can justify almost any behavior in terms of looking at either end of the value exchange, right? So we're doing something in the benefit of the business, or we're doing taking actions in the benefit of the consumer, and that's whether or not those things come to fruition, those value exchanges, we can take the efforts to make these connections using identity. But what's really critical in that evaluation is the fairness of the exchange. And so as we look at identity, we have to look at, what are we connecting? What are we able to connect? What are the right things that we should be connecting, right? How do we even look at identity today in context to how we may have looked at identity historically, right? It has, it used to be kind of three different ways that we would look at identity, right? Anonymous, PII, and now we've got this new pseudo-anonymized, right, which is kind of the new one. But there's more and more ways to identify individuals as we move into the future, and there may even be an opportunity to kind of reset that framework because we have to be, the opportunity to connect identity has always been a challenge in the past, right? And but now we have all these opportunities at our fingertips, and now we have to tackle the next set of questions, which is what is the right thing we should do? What are the right actions we should take to be good stewards of both business value and consumer protections, right? And bringing and managing that value exchange in a very kind of managed and business-like way.
So that really gets us, thank you so much, Tom. That really gets us into the question two. Our second question that we're gonna kind of bang through is, what are the new ethical challenges and opportunities in the changing landscape as it relates to data ethics and identity resolution? I think of identity as a utility. I think of the level of precision you need. If you don't have precise identity resolution in pharma and patient outcomes, you're unethical, because lives hang in the balance. On the other end of the spectrum, where you have marketing and advertising and brand outreach, the level of precision, lives don't necessarily depend on it or hang in the balance. So I think we're on a scale. There are other things along the path, utility things that are not quite marketing and advertising, either push or pull, but financial services identity resolution. So we really exist on a continuum. And if I were going to get us back to where the technology is at the moment, knowing we're experiencing volume, velocity, variety of data and technology and AI, what are the challenges and opportunities with the volume, velocity, variety in the marketing and advertising space, where pharmas too need to reach out and engage all of us in our connected life, so that there's awareness, so that there's a two-way dialogue. Talk a little bit about, yes, the challenges, and yes, the opportunities, if you could, Tom.
Sure. Yeah. As I said, one of the first things that I think that needs to be addressed is the categorization. I think that the landscape is changing, and I think that there's effort and opportunity that probably need to be taken to kind of understand and define that better. We always get tripped up on language, right? Language is always the greatest challenge, and having that clarity, so we're all speaking to the same thing and have the same context when we're using language, is really, really important. The other thing to look at is, when you look at the difference between ethics and compliance, within an organization, most organizations have compliance officers, but what are the structures and processes that are being used to provide that guidance layer for ethics, right? Who are the decision makers? What's their responsibility and accountability to the organization? As we look at identity in creating opportunity to improve consumer experiences, when does consumer tracking cross from, improving experiences to just becoming straight surveillance, right? Because we don't want to do that. So it always has to be framed in, driving value and not being gathering data for the sake of gathering data, right? It has to be with intent and transparency, right? What data sets should or should not be connected at the different levels of identity, right? We shouldn't bring all data necessarily to a single view. And as we think about, the opportunities, I think this is the really interesting opportunity as we look forward, right? Because when you look at compliance, that's truly can be kind of categorized as risk mitigation, right? What's the things that we should not do? But I think as we start to flip the conversation, talk about ethics, it really creates us to look at the other end of it. Is what are the things that we should do? How can we create new opportunities for organizations and consumers, and looking at mutually beneficial opportunities? Identity and data ethics are critical components in the move from big data to right data. How do we use data ethics to shift that conversation from casting a wide net to finding the right signals and maybe not collecting all the other ancillary cargo data? And I think data partnerships are another massive opportunity, and identity is critical in creating those connections to increasing consumer experiences and creating a greater value chain.
Context matters. The use of data matters, so that's the activation. We may think with data, but when we act on data and when there's an impact and consequence to a person, that is the other point I think you've highlighted for us, and I'm going to call out, and that is it requires judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Judgment is based on our cultural values and our social norms. We all agree it's never a good thing to peer in somebody's window, right? So that would be a social norm. So there are variations of that in the connected digital space. Again, to the points that keep coming up, that we keep illuminating, the utility of being able to connect is one thing. The data, the attribute, the describing data that comes along with it is the other type of data. And then the really, really critical piece where data ethics comes into play is use. How do you use the ability to identity resolve? How do you use the describing data to activate, to reach and engage your audience? And those are very important key takeaways. I want to raise another one of the questions that we had talked about before, and I'm going to go over to Tom to kick us off, and then to Alexander, and then to Knud, and that is the ability to resolve identity, to manage your data, integrate disparate data sets, and then to recognize when you're dealing with a certain user or a certain household has long been done on the basis, and I think we said a moment ago, historically we had identifiable data. Now we have not directly identifiable data or pseudonymous data. Increasingly, that's becoming important in the connected space. So here's my next question to the group. Technology is advancing rapidly, and technology has given us the ability to not rely on traditional identifiers or connector keys like name, address, email, phone numbers, hashed email, cookie IDs. But now we have AI that can very quickly and rather precisely recognize discrete users. So how do we feel about that? How does technology blur the lines between what is ethical and what is not? Tom, would you explore for us first?
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. And it is an interesting topic because it brings together two areas of ethics, AI and identity, which are already challenging enough, and then smushes them together into one very complex conversation. So yeah, it challenges. The first thing that we have to recognize is that this capability, as you set up in the beginning, we have a identity and we have the attributes, the data that travels with it. And so the first thing we have to recognize is that AI blurs the lines between those two, right? Because now the data, the cargo data, the attribute data that's observable of what you're doing can now be assembled and connected to be a proxy for identity, right? So there's no longer a hard and fast line between those two sets, right? Particularly with technology's enablement. And so we really have to understand, it's kind of started with device fingerprinting and those types of things, and now it's gone into kind of behavioral types data, from different channels. And now that we can bring multi-channel data together to see kind of full view of behavior, it really creates that driving need to understand. It creates urgency in understanding collectively and individually, what's our ethical tolerance for bringing together these data sets, and how do we intend to use them? Because when you have that data repository sitting there and you have the ability to apply AI and connect this data together, then it really becomes not can we do it, but should we do it? And if we don't have those principles and set up to help guide the organization, it could happen, right? It could be done. And it's really critical that organizations examine that, because, it's like Pandora's box, right? Once it's out, right, it's out, right? So you really got to examine that before that road is taken.
Thank you so much. Yep,
Sure.
that was great. Thank you so much. You know, what I hear, just reflecting what I'm hearing is there's no privacy, or that's probably not the right thing to say out loud, but the obscurity, the inability to do something. It's, you know, Tom, you've heard me say it a million times, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And you just said it yourself. And technology is approaching a scale and a capability that there are no practical barriers to what you can do anymore. We've overcome and we continue to overcome. So it really then depends on judging what we should and what we shouldn't, when it's a bridge too far. And those really are the ethical challenges. And yes, it comes with the describing data and how you apply the describing data. But it also, what I think I heard was, as these technologies take us forward, where it overcomes all barriers, we now have to judge when it is okay to become highly precise and overcome sort of the natural traditional identifiers, and when is it not? When should we be less precise? You know, reflecting again, what I think is emerging clearly from all three of you guys is context matters, judgment matters, the use, the impact, the consequence, and the outcome matter, and we have to judge those in context from a people-centered view. I received a private chatted question. I'm going to throw it out to the group. And while we're getting through some of these questions that are coming in, I want you Tom, Alexander, and Canute, to prepare your key takeaways, which we'll cover here in a few minutes. But the question is, identity resolution as a utility, which allows us to accurately manage data. If it's inaccurately managed, is that unethical to people? Is inaccuracy unethical? So let me throw that over to Tom. You want to start with that question?
Sure. No, that's an interesting question. I love that, because we always think about identity as a perfect in a perfect solution, but what about in an imperfect solution, right? I think when you think of, well, I think it's not only is it unethical. I think a key component of data ethics is fairness of the value exchange and kind of that transparency bit of it. And so, you know, if you're bringing together incorrect views of individuals and you're not doing it in a way where somebody can say, hey, that's not right information about me, you've kind of failed those first two components of data ethics, right? Because those are critical to having you know, a viable and an ethical solution, right? So I think that's the first thing. Secondarily, it's just not good business practice, right? It's going to lead to poor outcomes. You're not going to get lift. Just from a business perspective, you know, it would ideally you would lead to a better solution, because I think the learnings would be, you know, the juice isn't worth the squeeze, right? We're bringing together ideas and information that aren't driving value. So hopefully just the business sense of that would drive the ethical sense. But yeah, I think it's not probably, from an ethical perspective, I think it would be judged as less than ethical. I don't like to use the words unethical, because that's applying judgment, but we would say it's less ethical. Yeah.
And we have another question, but let's just center on the consent question that was sent in. What's your view on consent? Should you always get consent from consumers before accumulating data? And I'll break that into the two buckets I gave at the framer. There is the identity type of data that performs a utility, identity resolution, and then there's the data that describes, that allows us to do an application of a personalized or tailored event. So consent is a conversation right now on both of those. Let's hear from Tom quickly, and then let's kind of parse out, because the consent debate is really, it's really a very important one, and there's a bit of a paradox there, and we could go quite deep on that. But Tom, just quickly, your thoughts on consent.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and you know, I don't think like almost everything, I don't think that there's a one size fits all solution, right? I think it has to be when you're setting up your principles and guidelines for data ethics. I think identifying within that framework the areas where consent is needed and where consent is not. I think the accountability piece is absolutely paramount, but there are times where a consumer may not be aware of how the data might be used, and maybe that is an appropriate place. But then there is an expectation that the public would be informed, or should be relatively aware. If you get a free service and you're providing your data, right, it's not a free service, right? You're providing your data, and so there's some expectation that they understand 20 years into a digital industry, that's how that industry operates. And so I think you really have to kind of take a look at it on a use case by use case basis, and think, what would be, as we look at, the guidelines of data ethics, what would be the expectation from the consumer? And if it doesn't fit the expectation, then maybe consent is required. But in general, I don't like an experience where you have to kind of constantly be clicking a box.
Yeah, so there's a very practical view. Thank you. There's a very practical piece of this, which is experiential for people. So consent is a bit of a paradox. It's also very contextual, and it gets to, if you don't have a precise identity resolution capability, you can't apply consent. If you don't have the data, you can't detect bias in the data. So this is, it needs more conversation. We've got to arrive at something. I think collectors and users of data ought to be accountable. With the last few seconds, your number one thought for our audience, your number one key takeaway.
Yeah, I think real quickly, we've worked so hard to increase our maturity in this space, 20, 30 years to get to this spot. And I think it's time we need to recognize we're here, and we need to kind of take a step back and exercise some restraint and think about what we should do instead of can we do it. I think that's the most critical.